There is a moment in every man's life where the ground shifts beneath his feet. Not with a crash, not with a warning, just a quiet, terrible tilting. Like the world decided to rearrange itself while he was standing still, and nobody thought to tell him. For Marcus Calloway, that moment didn't come during his 2 tours overseas. It didn't come when his father died, or when his business nearly collapsed in 2019, or when the woman he loved for 3 years before Claire walked out without so much as a goodbye note. No. For Marcus, the moment that rearranged everything came at 2:17 in the morning on a cold Thursday in February, standing in his own living room, in his own house, holding the phone of the woman he was supposed to marry in 60 days. His hands were not shaking because he was afraid, or they were shaking because what he was reading on that screen was not what he expected. It was not what any man prepares himself for. He had spent 30 days convinced he already knew the truth. 30 days of silence, of watching, of pulling back. The way men like Marcus are trained to do when something feels wrong. 30 days of sleeping next to a woman and feeling further from her than he had felt from anyone in his entire life. And in those 30 days, he had built a story in his head, a complete story, with a villain and a betrayal and an ending he had already started grieving. He was wrong. He was so completely, devastatingly wrong. And the truth that replaced his story was something he will spend the rest of his life trying to put into words. Most men think they know the woman they are about to marry. Marcus thought he knew everything about Claire, her laugh, her coffee order, the way she hummed quietly to herself when she was nervous. This low, almost unconscious sound she made when she was trying to hold herself together. He thought he had her completely figured out, until the night he found 847 messages from a contact saved as simply no one. Before we go any further, before we walk into the full weight of this story, you need to understand something about the kind of man Marcus Calloway is and the kind of woman Claire Hendricks was, and why this story matters beyond the two of them. Because this is not a story about a relationship falling apart. This is not a cautionary tale about trust issues or red flags or the warning signs you missed. And this is a story about what happens in the space between two people, the space that exists even in the most committed, the most loving, the most apparently solid relationships, when both people are carrying something they have never spoken out loud. It is a story about silence, not the comfortable kind, the kind that accumulates over months and years, the way water collects behind a dam, invisible from the outside, unbearable in its pressure from within. And before we go any further, we want to take just a moment to say, if you are watching this right now and this story is already pulling at something in your chest, something you recognize, drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we tell on this channel are exactly this: real, human, complicated, and honest. Now I want to keep 3 questions in the back of your mind as this story unfolds. Who was on the other end of those 847 messages? Why did Claire feel she could not tell the man she was about to marry, the man who had promised to stand beside her for the rest of his life? And why does Marcus, to this day, say that he was not the victim in this story, that he was the one who nearly became the villain? Hold those questions, because every answer leads to another question, and the final answer, the one that comes at the end of 30 days of silence and one long, cold February night, will change the way you think about the people you love and what you actually know about them. To understand what happened in that living room on a February night, you have to understand where Marcus Calloway came from. You have to understand the world that shaped him, because the way a man responds to uncertainty is almost never about the moment he is standing in. It is almost always about the moments that came before. Marcus grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, a town that sits just north of Nashville, close enough to the city to know what it is missing, far enough away to have its own identity entirely. It is a military town. Fort Campbell sits right on the Kentucky border. And if you grow up in Clarksville, you grow up around men in uniform, men who carry themselves with a particular kind of quietness, a particular economy of emotion, men who were trained to feel things privately and act on them publicly. Marcus's grandfather served in Korea. His father never served, but he ran a hardware store for 31 years with the same discipline and consistency you would expect from a soldier. Up before dawn, closed at 6, no complaints, no excuses. Marcus absorbed all of it. The silence, the self-reliance, the deep-seated belief that a man handles his problems internally and only shows the outside world what he has already resolved. He was a good student, never exceptional, the kind of kid who was respected without being celebrated. He played football in high school, not because he loved it, but because it was what the men in his family did. They showed up, they did the work, they did not make it about themselves. At 19, he enlisted. 2 tours, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. He came back quieter than he left. With the way almost every veteran comes back quieter than they left, carrying a particular kind of weight that does not have a name in the civilian vocabulary. He did not talk about it. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that Marcus also never really talked about anything. Not because he was cold. People who know him will tell you he was one of the most loyal, most consistently present men they had ever known. But because somewhere along the line, in the military, in his family, in the culture of the town he grew up in, he had received a very clear message. A man who talks about what is inside him is a man who has not yet learned to manage it. So Marcus managed it. He came back from his second tour in 2004, took a job with a construction crew, learned the trade from the ground up, and by 2011 had started his own contracting business with 2 employees and 1 truck. By 2019, when the story we are telling today begins to move toward its turning point, he had 14 employees, 3 trucks, and a reputation in the greater Nashville area as the kind of contractor who showed up when he said he would and delivered what he promised. He was in every visible way a man who had built something from nothing and who had done it entirely on his own terms. What he had not built and what he had not allowed himself to want for a very long time was a life that included someone else at its center. Claire Hendricks grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, about 40 miles southeast of Nashville, a mid-sized city that has grown rapidly over the past 2 decades as Nashville has expanded outward. She was the second of 3 children in a family that, from the outside, looked exactly like what a family is supposed to look like. A house in a subdivision, a father who coached youth soccer on weekends, a mother who organized the school fundraiser every spring, barbecues in the summer, Christmas cards every December with everyone smiling in matching colors. From the outside, it was a picture of American normalcy so complete it could have been a catalog. Claire was, by every account, a gentle and perceptive child. The kind of kid who noticed things other kids did not notice, who remembered the details of conversations weeks after they had happened, who would check on a friend not because they had said something was wrong, but because something in their voice had been slightly off. She was sensitive in the truest sense of the word, not fragile but deeply attuned. She graduated from Middle Tennessee State University with a degree in early childhood education, moved to Nashville, and spent the next decade working as a reading aide in a public elementary school in the Madison neighborhood. She was, by all accounts, extraordinary at her job, patient in a way that her colleagues found almost impossible to replicate, able to sit with a struggling 7-year-old for 45 minutes without any visible frustration, reading the same sentence over and over until something clicked. She volunteered at a food pantry on the first and third Saturday of every month. She remembered birthdays without being prompted by social media. She brought food to neighbors when they were sick. She was, in every observable way, one of those rare people who seem to have been designed for care, for the quiet, unglamorous, daily work of making the people around them feel seen. And yet, there was something in Claire that the people who loved her most could not quite name, a private quality that went beyond introversion, a layer of herself that she kept carefully, methodically sealed off. Her closest friend, a woman named Denise, who had known her since college, once described it this way. It was like Claire had a room inside her that she never let anyone into, not because she was hiding something shameful, but because whatever was in that room was so fragile, so carefully preserved, that she was terrified of what would happen if she let in the wrong person. And so she let in no one, not until Marcus. They met at a 4th of July cookout in 2021, hosted by a mutual friend in East Nashville. Marcus almost did not go. He had been to 3 cookouts that summer and was, as he later put it, deeply tired of making small talk over potato salad with people he would never see again. But he went, and within 20 minutes of arriving, he found himself standing near the back fence talking to a woman in a yellow dress who was not performing, not networking, not trying to impress anyone, who was simply, genuinely present in the conversation in a way that Marcus found almost startling. He told their mutual friend the next morning. She was the first person in years who made him feel like he did not have to explain himself. For Claire, it was something slightly different. She had dated carefully and rarely since her previous long-term relationship had ended 4 years earlier. An engagement of 6 years to a man named Thomas that concluded quietly without a dramatic rupture. Just a slow mutual recognition that they had been together for comfort rather than connection. Marcus was different. He was direct without being aggressive. He was quiet without being closed off. He asked exactly one question about her past. Just one. And when she deflected it, he did not push. He simply nodded and moved on. And later she told Denise, "I felt safe. I felt like this was someone who would not force me to become something I am not ready to be." They dated for 14 months before Marcus proposed. Simple proposal. No fanfare, no production. A Tuesday night dinner at home, his grandmother's ring, and 4 honest words. "I want this with you." She said yes before he finished the sentence. And for the first few months after the engagement, everything was exactly what it looked like. Warm and solid and full of the particular sweetness that comes when 2 people who have been alone for a long time finally allow themselves to stop being alone. But then, somewhere around the 3rd month after the ring went on her finger, Marcus started noticing something. It was small at first, the kind of thing you could explain away without any effort at all. Claire started staying up after he went to bed. The first time Marcus woke up and found Claire's side of the bed empty, he thought nothing of it. He heard her downstairs, a quiet sound, barely audible. He assumed she could not sleep. He pulled the covers back up and was unconscious again within minutes. The second time, a week later, he got up and walked to the top of the stairs. He could see the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. He could hear her breathing, steady and low, like she was either asleep or deep in thought. He went back to bed. By the 5th time, he was no longer dismissing it. By the 8th time, something had shifted in the architecture of his thinking. A quiet, structural change, the way a foundation shifts before any crack appears at the surface. He never asked. That is the part of this story that Marcus returns to again and again when he talks about it. The fact that for nearly a month he watched and waited and built his internal case without ever once simply asking the woman he loved what was going on. He will tell you that was about his training. Assess before you engage. He will tell you that was about his temperament, his upbringing, the way he had always processed uncertainty. And all of that is true. But he will also tell you, with the particular honesty of a man who has spent real time in a therapist's office working through it, that it was also about fear, because asking meant she had to answer. And if she answered in the way he had begun to suspect, he would have to do something about it. And so he did nothing. He withdrew instead. Not cruelly. Marcus Calloway is not a cruel man. He was present at dinner. He showed up for the things they had committed to together. He was not cold or hostile or punishing in any way that Claire could have named with certainty. But the warmth pulled back. In the small moments of contact, the hand on her shoulder as he passed, the text in the middle of the afternoon just because he was thinking of her, those things quietly stopped. And the distance between them, which had no visible cause and no spoken explanation, began to grow. For 30 days, Marcus Calloway stood on one side of that distance and watched his fiancée across it and waited for something to break. Meanwhile, Claire, who was perceptive enough to feel the change even without being told what caused it, who noticed things other people did not notice, who had been reading emotional atmospheres her entire life, went quieter herself, not defensively, almost gently, like she was giving him room. And that gentleness, that patience, that refusal to escalate somehow made the distance feel worse. It was a Thursday in February. Marcus had a client dinner on the north side of Nashville that ended earlier than expected. The contractor and the client had covered everything in 40 minutes, and there was nothing left to say. So Marcus drove home through the cold, through streets still slick from the afternoon's rain, and pulled into his driveway at 9:48 p.m. Claire's car was there. The house was almost entirely dark except for a single lamp in the living room, visible through the front window, a small, warm rectangle of light in an otherwise dark face of the house. He let himself in quietly. She was asleep on the couch. She was lying on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing slow and even. Her phone was still in her other hand, screen dimming but not yet dark, and the screen was still unlocked. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long time. He will tell you that in that moment, he had a conversation with himself. The kind of conversation that happens in the space of 3 or 4 seconds, but feels much longer. He told himself to set the phone on the coffee table and go upstairs. He told himself he was better than this. He told himself that whatever was on that screen was either innocent or it was not, and that either way, this was not how he wanted to find out. He told himself all of that. And then he looked. He told himself later that he expected one of 2 things. Either nothing significant, a few texts with a girlfriend or a family member, something that would immediately make him feel foolish for the suspicion he had been carrying for a month, or confirmation of the story he had built in his head, another man's name, another man's words, and or the evidence that would at least give his feelings a target. He found neither. The contact was saved as no one. The thread contained 847 messages. The most recent was from that night, sent at 8:41 p.m., less than 90 minutes before Marcus had walked through the door. He read it, then he read the one before it, then he read further back, and within 3 minutes, the story he had been carrying for 30 days began to dissolve. Not with relief, but with a slow, suffocating weight that was entirely different from what he had expected. Because the messages were not romantic. There were no words of longing, no arrangements to meet, none of the vocabulary of an affair. What there was instead was pain, plain, exhausting, precisely documented pain. The kind that accumulates over decades and leaks out in short sentences, because full sentences are too much to carry all at once. Claire's messages were fragmented and honest in the way only a person writing in the dark at 2 a.m. to someone they trust completely can be honest. They were not meant for Marcus. They were not meant for anyone who knew her. And yet there he was, reading them, reading 31 years of a woman's life in a 4-minute scroll, and understanding for the first time, with a terrible and irreversible clarity, that he had never actually asked to know any of it. He did not wake her. He set the phone back in her hand, carefully, the way you set down something fragile. And he went upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and he stayed there for a long time. When in the morning Claire woke up, came upstairs, found him already dressed, and sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. He said good morning. She said good morning. They had breakfast together. He said nothing about the phone. She said nothing about the distance. It was, by every external measure, a completely ordinary morning, but something had changed in Marcus, something irreversible and quiet, the way a bone heals differently after a fracture. He spent the next 3 days doing what his military training had taught him to do before he engaged. He gathered information. He was not proud of this later. He will be the first to tell you that. But in those 3 days, using the reverse lookup tools available to anyone with an internet connection and enough sleeplessness to use them at midnight, he traced the number saved as no one. It did not belong to a man. It did not belong to anyone Claire knew personally. It belonged to a nonprofit organization, a crisis support and counseling line specifically serving adult survivors of childhood trauma. It was staffed by trained volunteer counselors. The number had been active for years. Marcus sat with that information for a long time. He read about the organization. He read about the work they did, the patient, consistent, unglamorous work of being available to people who had learned very early in their lives that the people who were supposed to be available to them were not. He read about the specific population they served. Adults who had grown up in homes where something was wrong in a way that nobody outside the home ever quite saw, who had become experts at appearing fine, not at building normal lives over the top of experiences that were anything but normal. And something in Marcus, the 30 days of suspicion, the constructed story, the convinced certainty that he had been betrayed, began to crumble. Not because he was relieved, but because he recognized, with a force that surprised him, that he had spent a month building a case against a woman who had been quietly, privately fighting a battle he had never thought to ask about. He recognized something else too, something harder to sit with, that in 30 days of watching and withdrawing and waiting, he had not once thought to simply reach toward her. Not once. Here is what Marcus was able to piece together before he had the actual conversation with Claire. And this is important because it tells you something about the kind of care and the kind of pain that had been living in their house alongside them without Marcus ever seeing it. Claire had been in contact with the crisis line for nearly 2 years, not occasionally, consistently, weekly at minimum, and sometimes more often during the stretches when whatever she was carrying became too heavy to carry alone at her current capacity. The counselor she had connected with, a trained volunteer named Daniel, not a name she ever mentioned to Marcus, not a name that appeared anywhere in her daily life as Claire presented it, had become, over those 2 years, the most honest relationship Claire had. Not romantic, not personal in the conventional sense, but honest in a way that nothing else in her life had been allowed to be. Because Daniel did not know her as Claire the teacher, Claire the volunteer, Claire the warm and capable and always present woman that everyone in her life experienced. Daniel knew her as Claire the survivor, and that distinction, that specific and radical permission to be known without the performance of okayness, had been the thing that kept her functional during the period when she was also, simultaneously, building a life with Marcus. He had not known any of this. He had proposed to a woman whose daily interior reality he had never once fully witnessed. And the question that settled over him, in the days between finding the phone and having the conversation, the question he could not put down, was not who Claire had been talking to. It was whether he had ever made it safe enough for her to talk to him. And this is the part of the story that matters most for the people watching it. Not the investigation, not the revelation, but this particular moment in Marcus's account, when he looks back at 30 days of silence and withdrawal and constructed certainty and has to acknowledge what it actually was. He was afraid, not of Claire, not of betrayal, or not only of that, he was afraid of the specific vulnerability that comes from asking someone you love a real question and having to sit with whatever they actually say. He was afraid of what it would mean if she said something that required him to respond with something he did not know how to say. He had spent his entire life, from his father's hardware store to Fort Campbell to 14 employees and 3 trucks, learning to be a man who did not need anything from anybody. A man who solved problems, a man who assessed and engaged and delivered. And love, real love, the kind that requires you to sit in uncertainty with another person without knowing the outcome. That was not a skill anyone had taught him. That was not in the vocabulary of the world he came from. So he had done what men like Marcus do when they encounter something they do not know how to handle. He had reframed it. He had turned a question into a suspicion, and a suspicion into a case, and a case into a story that had a conclusion he could manage. Betrayal, yes, that would hurt, but at least it was a problem he could act on. At least it was familiar. The truth was not familiar. The truth required something entirely different from him. And on day 33, 3 days after he found the phone, 3 days after the floor shifted, Marcus Calloway sat down across from Claire Hendricks at their kitchen table, looked at her, and said 4 words. "Tell me about yourself." She did not ask him what he meant. That was the first thing. She did not deflect or laugh it off or redirect to logistics, the wedding venue deposit, the caterer, the seating chart, the way they had both been redirecting for a month. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Marcus later said he could feel his own heartbeat. And then she set down her coffee cup and she started talking. It took 3 hours. It did not come out in a straight line because real things almost never do. It came out the way water comes through old pipes, in starts and stops, in bursts of pressure followed by long silences. In moments where she would get to the edge of something and then pull back and then, after a breath, push through it. Claire's father had been 2 different people. That was how she put it, and the quiet precision of that phrase, 2 different people, said everything it needed to say without requiring elaboration. The man who coached youth soccer and organized the Christmas card and shook hands at church on Sundays was one version. The version that existed inside the house, behind the closed door, in the hours after the neighborhood had gone to sleep, that was the other version. Claire had been 5 years old the first time she understood that these two versions were not the same person. She had been managing the distance between them, and everything that distance created in her for the 36 years since. She had never told her mother, who had her own survival to manage. She had never told her college friends, her co-workers, her previous partner of 6 years. She had told a crisis counselor named Daniel because Daniel was not in her life, and being outside her life meant he could not change the way she existed within it. The crisis line had been the one place in her world where she did not have to be fine, and she had never in 2 years with Marcus felt certain enough. Safe enough, she said, and the word landed on Marcus like a weight he would carry for a long time, to bring that particular truth into the space between them. Not because of anything Marcus had done, but because of everything she had been taught long before she ever met him, about what happens when you let someone see the version of you that exists behind the closed door. She had been taught that it changes things, that the person on the receiving end either flinches or they leave. And so she had kept the door closed, and she had kept talking to Daniel at 2 a.m. because 2 a.m. was the only hour where the performance of okayness finally ran out of fuel, and she was too tired to maintain it. Marcus listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer solutions. He did not say the things he had always said when someone brought him a problem. Let me fix this. Let me find the answer. Let me turn this into something I can act on. He just listened. And at some point, he is not sure exactly when, somewhere in the second hour, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything. He just left it there. And Claire, who had spent 3 decades waiting to find out what happened when someone saw her behind the closed door, said later that in that moment, she finally had her answer. He did not flinch. He did not leave. He stayed in the chair. Marcus and Claire were married 4 months later, not in the venue they had booked, not with the guest list they had assembled. They canceled all of it and had a backyard ceremony with 22 people in June, in the yard of the home they had been building their life in, with string lights and a borrowed sound system and a neighbor who officiated. Their closest friends said it felt more like them than any formal event could have. Marcus started therapy 6 weeks after the kitchen table conversation. Not because Claire asked him to. Not because anyone suggested it. He found a therapist on his own. A man who worked specifically with veterans and first responders, who understood the particular architecture of a life built around the belief that needing something was a form of weakness. He went every week for a year. He still goes once a month. He has said in the time since that it was the hardest thing he's ever done. Harder than 2 tours. Harder than building a business from nothing. Because it required him to stop solving and start sitting, to sit inside the uncertainty of his own interior life without reaching for a conclusion. Claire continued working with Daniel for another 8 months after the conversation, eventually transitioning to a therapist of her own. A woman who specialized in the specific kind of long-term trauma that comes from growing up in a home where the version of a parent presented to the world is fundamentally different from the version that exists behind closed doors. She is still in therapy. She does not consider this a sign that something is wrong. She considers it a sign that something is right, that she finally has access to the version of herself that spent 36 years behind a closed door. The contact in Claire's phone is still saved as no one. She has never changed it. She told Marcus that she keeps it that way as a marker, a reminder of the distance between who she was when she created that contact and who she is now. A reminder that no one turned out to be someone, that the people she had been most afraid to let in turned out to be the ones most capable of staying. And Marcus, the man who spent 30 days in silence, building a story that turned out to be completely wrong, treating a question like a threat instead of an opening. Marcus says this: the most important thing he has ever built is not the business, not the house, not the life that looks from the outside like a man who got everything right. It is the 18 inches across a kitchen table, the distance between his hand and hers, The moment when he stopped assessing and engaging and delivering, and just sat there in the uncertainty and let someone be known. Here is what stays with you after you hear the story. Not the 30 days of silence, not the 847 messages, not the night he stood in the living room holding her phone while she slept on the couch. What stays with you is this, that in almost every relationship, in almost every home, there is a version of this story playing out in some form. A person carrying something they have not yet found the language or the safety to say out loud. A person on the other side who senses something is wrong but does not know how to ask, or is afraid of what the asking might cost them. And the gap between those two people, that gap of silence and assumption and carefully maintained performance, is not filled by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, or any of the things we have been taught to believe make a relationship strong. It is filled by one person deciding to stop managing and start asking, by 4 words at a kitchen table, by a hand placed over another hand and left there without explanation. Marcus and Claire are still together. They are not the same people they were the night he found the phone. They are something better than that, something harder won, something that costs them both a real and specific kind of courage that does not get celebrated because it is quiet and slow and deeply unglamorous. And the question that this story leaves you with, the one we want you to sit with after this video ends, the one that Marcus himself cannot stop thinking about, is this. Is there someone in your life right now who is talking to no one because they do not yet believe that you are safe enough to talk to? And if there is, what would it take for you to close the distance?